The first part is to decouple from China strategically. And if you go to most Americans today, 30% of the items in their homes are manufactured in China. And the thing you would at least do then is you would stop being dependent on China for things that matter, and you would stop helping China in things that matter. And that would be a huge step forward.
Let's talk about confronting China and securing America.
Yeah, the thing about changing the direction of the country is you got to win elections, and you got to have ideas, and those two are related. You got to have leaders that can win primaries, win general elections, and then have ideas for taking the country forward, and then they got to execute them. And so when I was thinking about writing Superpower in Peril, I didn't want it to just be an ideas book. I wanted it to be a leadership book too, because that's what it's all about. It's all about leaders. When I was telling that Ronald Reagan story, it's about the leaders. And so I identified a couple areas where I thought leadership was really, really important. And the first one was China. And when we talk about China, there's two things we need to do. We needed to go to the gym at home. So you and I just spent an hour talking about the gym, data and technology and education. But you also need to confront China and have a strategy for how we deal with China. And we need leaders who know how to do that. And so I talk about my background in China. I went to China after I left the military for the first time in 1992. And I had read this book, which was called Riding the Iron Rooster, through China, which is this guy, Paul Thoreau. So I went into China, was there for about probably 6 weeks, just by myself with a backpack. And this train was this dilapidated train that drove through the countryside. But China was rural. And I went to Beijing, and there was, a handful of skyscrapers. I went running in the gardens in Shanghai. There was no Caucasian people. Everybody was doing Tai Chi, and who is this crazy guy? There was two currencies, a local one and one for tourists. I mean, it was just a country from the almost left behind. And then I went back 16 years later as a government official, and it was just full of skyscrapers, a 10-lane highway to the downtown of Beijing. And China was going through this incredible transformation, which sadly went off course and became increasingly a threat to American interest. And I saw that early on in the government. I was in the Commerce Department in 2005, and I was in charge of technology exports, and there was all sorts of pressure from the Chinese to export certain technologies. They came and talked to President Bush about the job I was doing because they said I was being too just restrictive. I wrote a bunch of speeches and op-eds. But what's happened since then is even far worse than anybody would have imagined, because China has stolen all the technology, built its own indigenous capability. It's not been reciprocal on trade. So the deal was initially, the initial vision was, hey, we'll give access to U.S. markets, you give access to China's markets. That never happened. And China took increasingly the interests of China and the U.S. diverged. And then President Xi came in and went like that. Because President Xi had a view of the world which was very counter to the United States. China's rightful place was on top, displacing America as the superpower. And all that bad behavior that I'm describing got much, much worse under President Xi. And President Xi really created the techno-authoritarian model that we've described. And unfortunately, what's happened over the last decade or so is our policymakers have been sleepwalking. Sleepwalking through this. They missed it. Republicans and Democrats alike missed it. They missed the growing risk of China. And then President Trump showed up. And to his credit, and I give him credit in the book and I gave him credit on the campaign trail, he called out China for what it was, which is a true adversary, and began to put in place a set of policies to deal with that, ensuring more reciprocal trade and so forth. And what I'm arguing for is a much more comprehensive strategy, a whole-of-nation strategy to address China. And China has a plan, and we don't have a plan. And so that strategy has 4 parts. The first part is to decouple from China strategically. And you talked about, you mentioned this earlier, I mentioned it earlier, but during COVID, we discovered that we were dependent on China for our supply chains for pharmaceuticals. Shocking. I didn't know that. I honestly didn't know that. I didn't know that 90% of the semiconductors are manufactured 90 miles from mainland China. We have put ourselves in a position of huge vulnerability. So we need to very consciously bring those industries home that are critical to America's security, critical to our future. And that's what I mean by strategic decoupling. Let's identify those key sectors, satellites or AI, whatever it is, and let's make sure we've got the capability here at home. We can't be dependent on China. That's the first thing. Second thing is we got to hold China accountable. We call balls and strikes on the bad behavior, the human rights abuses in China. We're not going to go into China and fix their system for human rights. I'm not saying that, but we need to call it out for what it is. I mean, President Biden did a lot to call out what was going on in Saudi Arabia. There's millions of Uyghurs killed out in China, and there's no voice. But we also have to hold them accountable for COVID. The fact that the COVID virus became such a burden on the world, the United States, the millions of lives lost, the trillions of dollars, with zero cooperation or transparency from China. And again, I'm not saying it was intentional to start COVID. I don't know, but we don't know because they haven't actually dealt with it in a transparent way. So that's the second thing.
How would we hold them accountable?
Well, it could be sanctions. It could be a whole, if nothing else, you start by every time you talk about China, you start with that. Like literally just saying, hey, to the world, are you kidding me? Like, why are you letting this bad behavior persist? That's been nowhere. President Biden has said nothing on that. And then there's all sorts of economic tools that we could use to say, hey, we're not going to do this unless you do that. But because we haven't even called it out as bad behavior, it's very difficult to get that momentum now. But that's what we need to do. The third thing is involving investment. So you made the point that I ran an investment firm. My view on China has only gotten more incrementally worried as the situation's evolved, but I just want to put it in context. So I ran an investment firm that's one of the biggest in the world. We had 2% of our business in China, investing in broader markets. And if you go to most Americans today, 30% of the items in their homes are manufactured in China. So our economies are very integrated. So when people say we need to stop all economic activity with China today, I'm not sure they totally understand what they're saying because not only do we have that huge amount of trade, but then the trade goes through other countries. So we sell things to the Netherlands that they then finish manufacturing and send it to China. So our economies are very integrated. What we need to do on that strategic decoupling is make sure, first and foremost, we're not dependent on China for anything that matters. And then the second thing we need to do in investment is we need to create a process for ensuring nobody is investing in China, no company is investing in China in a way that supports the Chinese military or the Communist Party. And today, we have investors in the Silicon Valley that are investing in artificial intelligence companies in China that are working with the PLA. So that is completely unacceptable. So when we talk about investment in China and investment from China, the most important thing I would start with, and it's not happening today. So all the talk and the rhetoric, these things aren't happening, is I would strategically decouple in the way I described, and I would put an investment review process in place. And the thing you would at least do then is you would stop being dependent on China for things that matter, and you would stop helping China in things that matter. And that would be a huge step forward. And then we can begin to think about how we untangle our economies further as we move forward. And I felt this on the campaign trail because I'd go into some manufacturers and they go, China killed me. Like the outsourcing and all that stuff killed me to China. And then I go in the next one and there'd be like a Harley Davidson supplier and they'd say, hey man, China's our biggest market. We're sending Harley Davidsons to China. So as someone who's been an economic guy, who's run a couple companies and been in the military, my basic view is let's start with we can't do anything with China that's going to sacrifice our security. And then once we get that done, let's talk about what the next phase is. All the time holding China to a very high standard.
What do you think the repercussions are going to be from China if this comes to fruition? I mean, they're involved in so many different aspects. The thing that really bothers me the most, I think, is our energy. There's this huge green energy initiative. Who's going to manufacture all of that?
Yeah.
China. Who's got all the lithium mines?
Right.
China.
Well, this is the great irony of the Biden administration, right? So energy policy has done two things, I think. It's made us less secure, less environmental, and more dependent on China. Let me describe what I mean by that. So Pennsylvania is a huge fracking state. Got great natural resources there. If Pennsylvania were a country, it'd be like the fourth biggest natural gas reserves in the world. Okay. So it's huge. And so when President Biden came into office, he stopped the Keystone Pipeline. He doubled down on a number of regulations. And that was particularly challenging for fracking. And yet fracking is very, very clean from an environmental perspective. It's very, very safe from an environmental perspective. So almost overnight, what happened is we became less secure because we went from being an energy exporter to an energy importer. So we were dependent on others. It was damaging economically because all those jobs in places like Pennsylvania and Texas and elsewhere were pushed back because the purchases, the restrictions on drilling and so forth, and that does just hurt the energy industry. It hurts all the derivative industries that come with it, and so we're less economically viable, we're less secure, and it's worse for the environment because what happens when we're not bringing out natural gas and exporting it, we're importing much dirtier sources of fossil fuel from Nigeria or Saudi Arabia or elsewhere. So in one fell swoop, Biden made us less secure, he made us less economically viable, and he made us less environmentally sound. And I'm someone who, I'm an environmentalist in the sense that I've got a ranch that I, protect the things. I am very focused on protecting the environment, but I'm protecting in a way that's great for Americans, that's great for our industry, that's great for our national security. So that's the first thing. The second thing is all this spending in the infrastructure bill, in the Inflation Reduction Act, and even in the CHIPS Act to some degree, but mostly those first two, is pushing the green technology on and imposing it really on our economy as part of this transition. And finally, as you say, most of what's required to make that green revolution happen is highly dependent on China. So we're making our economy more dependent on China rather than building the indigenous capability at home.
So do we go back to fossil fuels, or do you think we need to start looking at nuclear energy?
I definitely think we should start looking at nuclear energy. Westinghouse is in Pennsylvania, and absolutely there's a next generation nuclear capability that has huge possibilities. The fossil fuel energy capabilities we have with natural gas is far cleaner than it's ever been in history, and there's carbon sequestration and lots of other things. So there's lots of ways that we can continue to take advantage of fossil fuels in a much more carbon-friendly, cleaner way. Build out nuclear is a real possibility. And listen, I'm not opposed to alternate fuels. I'm not opposed to the alternative industry. I'm opposed to being more dependent on China, and I'm opposed to a subsidy process that totally, undermines the market. And that's what's happening in this push for clean energy.
One question on your business dealings with China, even if they only were 2%, what I'd like to know is what was the turning point where you realized? Was it COVID? Was it the pharmaceutical industry?
The big difference I had, and I talk about this in the book, I wanted to sort of make a real point, and this became a very public thing. My difference with the founder of my firm, who is a big China supporter, is just not recognizing the threat from China. And so my view is that China has become an existential threat. It needs to be treated like an adversary, and that we need to have our economic policy and our national security policy reflect that reality. And so I recognize that if you went to the top 100 companies in the world, or companies based in the United States, U.S. companies, many of them are highly dependent on selling products into China at the moment. That is, important for American workers and all that stuff. So if we untangle from China's economy, it's going to have to be very careful how we do that as it affects American workers. But once you identify China as an adversary, then you start to do the kinds of things that I'm saying to mitigate your risk. And that's the point I try to make in the book, and that's how I reconcile all of it, which is to say what's become more and more clear over time is China's an adversary. And that was maybe more obvious sooner than people saw it, but it's certainly obvious after President Xi, and yet our country's not responding in a comprehensive way.
Hey everybody, I'm Shawn Ryan. Click here to subscribe to the Shawn Ryan Show YouTube channel for the hottest and most compelling interviews that you will not see anywhere else. I've also made a playlist of all the previous SRS episodes so they're easy to find. You can find that right here.